Hello, everyone. I'm Mystery.
And I am Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we are the Duality of Man. Apologies for how long this took, guys. Life has been a thing recently. Um, so much of a thing that I don't even have access to my camera today. So, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the prison system and how it can take men in and then just completely break them down and then leaves them worse off than when they first came in.
uh-huh. The suicide scene in Shawshank Redemption springs to mind. The old-fashioned commentary on institutionalization. Well, despite the fact that much of the romantic mystique of the Shawshank Redemption era of prisons is gone, um, the institutionalization did nothing whatsoever but get worse.
They reduce people down to basically a number on a sheet. They strip them of basically all of their rights and dignity. They cram them into a little box. They give them basically no freedom of movement, which I understand is a point of prison, but even still. And they put people who commit even lighter crimes in with some of the worst offenders. And
Which does nothing whatsoever to deconvert the worst offenders and everything to encourage the light offenders to become harder and more broken so as to survive in a harsh situation. And then
yeah,
boom, you have more severe criminals at the end of it. Seems rather counterproductive to me, but I'm old fashioned like that.
yeah, the people inside, they abuse each other, and oftentimes they're abused by the guards as well. And
And this was actually one of the main reasons I wanted to do this topic because, as we all know, one of the pillars, one of the central axioms of modern day third wave feminist theory is rape culture, which, incidentally, they stole from studies of prison rape in, I believe it was specifically juvenile detention facilities, which is notable because a large number of juvenile detention facilities, I can't speak today, are staffed by female guards. But as we all know, the majority of inmates are still male. So they took a situation which, in a significant plurality of cases, is perpetrated by adult women against juvenile boys, and they turned it into a women's issue in the real world instead of in the confines of the prison system because reasons of, well, frankly, because women can't possibly do anything wrong, and men who commit crimes are definitely evil. Trust us, no, we know what we're talking about, Derp. That's basically the only justification that ever gets brought up.
yeah, the propensity for rape in prison is a well known fact amidst wider society. It's not something that people aren't aware of. I mean, even when I was a kid, people were telling the "don't drop the soap" joke about being raped in the prison showers.
Well,
But
I mean, and to call back to reference I made earlier with Shawshank, because it is one of the best movies about prison and being imprisoned probably ever, which came out in, I believe, 1994, which, by the way, is the year before I was born. And even Shawshank had the sisters, and let's also keep in mind that Shawshank Redemption was based on a short story, possibly a novella, by Stephen King. So it's it's been known for as long as at least modern prison systems have existed, and probably significantly before that, because as inhumane as prisons are today, they were worse in many ways back in the day. In fact, most prisons and most mental institutions were kind of one and the same for a while. That's where we get the word bedlam from. There was a mental hospital and prison in London called Bethlem Hospital, and it became Bedlam in common usage.
Yeah. Doesn't didn't the name Bedlam become synonymous with chaos or disorder?
Yes, because unsurprisingly, when you take a bunch of unstable people and put them in inhumane conditions and throw shit at them, which is another thing that was interesting about Bedlam, um, the public was allowed to come in as though it were a museum or an amusement park attraction and see the prisoners, and it would often result in them being additionally abused by said visitors because people would throw shit at them, sometimes literally and sometimes in the form of fruit and the whole line, the whole throwing things at people cliche that you see in all kinds of movies and TV and whatnot. Which I can't imagine would have been very useful if you were, say, paranoid schizophrenic in a time before they understood what paranoid schizophrenia was, and all of a sudden people randomly start throwing shit at you.
Yeah. I can't imagine that'd be conducive to mental recovery. Of course, the understanding of the human mind was archaic to say the least back in those days. That was what, the 19th century?
Or significantly before. I believe Bedlam was first established in Shakespeare's day, in the Elizabethan period. So I imagine it's significantly older even than the 19th century. Although the cliche of the backwards sexually repressed Victorians um, is worth noting here, simply because I don't think the 19th century made it worse for, or rather made it better for people under those conditions. And even if it did, it only increased it from a humanitarian travesty to something that you could at least probably survive.
Yeah, I believe the 19th century was when they first started doing electroshock therapy on um, mental asylum inmates. Of course, not really having much of an understanding of what electricity does to the brain, they still engaged in these barbaric experiments on their fellow human beings.
Yes, and if that failed, there was always the lobotomy, which is another interesting thing about prisons. Because for a while there, the line between mental institution and prison was very, very blurry. A lot of the times in early medical experiments, um, if they needed to be done, they were done on prisoners.
Yeah, because who cares about the dregs of society?
They, they sinned possibly once, you see, and that means they should be condemned forever and in perpetuity.
In in many centuries, the conditions for the prison were so bad. The sanitary conditions, the living conditions were so bad that if you stayed long enough, it was basically a death sentence.
And let's not forget about the frequent use of solitary confinement for basically up until about 30 years ago, when we finally realized, wait, solitary confinement kind of fucks with everything. Which, to be fair, is something we should have known a long time before that, because
Humans are
um
social creatures. We need other people. Even
well
the most
yeah,
introverted person likes talking to other people.
there's that. I mean, a introvert will even resort to talking to themselves if there's no one else around that's worth talking to, and I can speak from a great degree of experience there. But interestingly enough, there's precedent for understanding that solitary confinement makes you go cuckoo bananas in the animal kingdom, because um, in horse raising, for example, there is the case of the stallion. Now, stallions have a reputation for being cuckoo bananas, But if you actually look at the behavior of wild stallions, they're not like that. The reason why domesticated stallions or broken stallions are cuckoo bananas is because the way people used to break them, at least a lot of the time, I'm not sure if it still happens, but historically, the way that you would break a stallion was to lock it in a box until it broke, until its spirit literally broke, and then it became docile and domesticatable. And unsurprisingly, just like when you stick a human in a box, you stick a horse in a box, who is also a social species, and they go a bit nuts. And I can't really fault most horses for not really liking the people who break them, just like, anyone else who's in such a traumatized situation.
Now, even though a lot of these practices aren't done anymore, the conditions in prisons are still really terrible and are not conducive to reformation. I mean, that's one of the
No,
purported purposes of the.
it's conducive to the development of prison culture, essentially. There's a really great series of videos done by a YouTuber who I don't even know if he does videos anymore, but if anyone's unfamiliar with the channel Hagbard Celine, and you want to get good and red pilled on the intricacies of the prison system and what it's like in there, would highly recommend some of his videos on the subject.
You know, in prison, you know, it's basically a bunch of people who have a tendency towards violence and low impulse control. So fights, things break out, and in order for people to, you know, feel safe, like mankind first um, developed, they form into groups, which is why you have then prison gangs.
Yeah, you remove humans from society, they will create one of their own. And as the old adage goes, if you eject enough young boys from the village, they will return come manhood to burn the village down.
I mean, thing is, these gangs they often prey on people who are new, people who are first time in prison, and it's a terrifying situation. I can imagine,
And
and
let's not forget that if you're in a desperate, horrifying situation, you will cling to whoever is the first one to throw you a lifeline often, and that's a very, very easy sales tactic for people who are in gangs and or cults, because the more vulnerable your psychology is, the more malleable it is because of neuroplasticity. So if you need to get people to conform to a batshit crazy ideology, put them under so much stress that their brain literally breaks, and then be the one to offer the solution. Even if that solution means nothing and never will mean anything. Cough, cough. Most forms of racial or identitarian uh, groupthink. Cough.
speaking of such things, like any society, they will inevitably develop their own ideologies, and you'll see a lot of these prison gangs sometimes split along racial lines. So, say you have somebody who is new in prison for like car theft. He's not racist, but because he's in prison and he has no protection, he might join a racist gang simply to survive.
And because of who he hangs with, the other races within that prison, regardless of the overall demographical information of any given prison or even any given country, will antagonize them just out of guilt by association, and that will probably bias his sample enough that he will think, well, they are all violent, terrible, horrible, really bad, no good people, and therefore I will stick with this racial bullshit even though it wasn't convincing at first. And while we're on the subject of race and prison, shall we talk about the racial sentencing gap? Because I think we would be pilloried in effigy and or ruined by the algorithm if we didn't at least um, give some mention of the racialized sentencing gap. And
Yeah,
then we can talk about the gendered sentencing gap, which will be even more fun.
there is one other thing you want to talk to before we get to the sentencing gap. It's that gangs are not the only way that people get protection from prison. There are some situations where people will basically consign themselves to an unwilling homosexual relationship with another inmate in order to gain their protection.
Yeah, again, let it be known always forever from the hilltops that prison rape was the initial impetus for rape culture as a concept, not some vast conspiracy of sexual domineering perpetrated by some militant patriarch 1,000 years ago or whatever the fuck.
So to get to the sentencing gap, I don't think it's any secret that um, African Americans and many other, I hate the term people of color, but I'm just going to use it here, are often sentenced more harshly than, say, white people would be sentenced for similar crimes. And I'm getting up the statistics right now. But
Mhm.
one thing that I think is important to notice is history. Um, is this like a first offense, or is this person a, say, a repeat offender? And the details of the crime, I think, are also important because I don't just want to shout racism like a lot of people tend to do today.
Yeah, Argle, Florgle, Blorgle racism sort of yes, but no, it's more complicated than that, and it's also worth noting that the vast majority of people in prison are in prison on nonviolent drug offenses.
Yes,
So
because what was it, the 1994 crime bill? Or
I the war on drugs started with Nixon, I thought. I don't know when the current crop of bullshit was signed. I imagine you're right because that's the only one that's coming to my brain off the top of my head. But in any case, the short answer is we could massively straighten out prisons and also probably large swaths of civilization in general if we stopped the drug war and legalized, tax, and regulated all drugs to a medical quality and purity standard. Just like the mob really wasn't a massive deal in America until Prohibition and then slowly began to wane immediately following the removal of prohibition as a thing because they got fat off of the trade in alcohol. Well, every time more strides are made in the legalization of marijuana, the drug cartels that currently exist take a massive hit. So, following the trend a bit, if we legalized and regulated all drugs, then the cartels would be as much of a non-entity, at least in our civilization, that the mob currently is in our civilization. And that sounds like a
I'm
better
not
future to
sure
me.
that's necessarily true though, because I recently read a report out of California that even though marijuana was legalized, people are still going to drug dealers because of the way that marijuana is being taxed in the state of California.
Well, I think it is safe to say um, Californian tax codes are not exactly emulatable in any meaningful or desirable way. But I am willing to say all other things being equal, meaning if you're not under the aegis of Californian tax law, generally the trend is the more you legalize and regulate for purity standard drugs, the less and less powerful the cartels and associated groups would be. And that would generally also minimize gang activity because large amounts of gang activity are tied to drug dealing and or cartels,
Yeah.
which would in turn butterfly effect to minimize the prison population to a ludicrous degree.
One thing that I think contributes to all the racial disparity in prison sentencing is uh, government plea deals. So the government will say arrest um, a low level guy or a guy of basically some petty crime, and they'll say if we take this to trial and you get convicted, you'll get say like 5 years. But if you sign this plea deal and plead guilty, we'll only give you 3 years. And so the guy not really wanting to take that risk or not realizing that he might have an actual chance of fighting this in court,
Yeah.
takes the plea deal and is automatically sentenced to so many years in prison.
And usually small print, 3 years is all they would have gotten away with charging him with either way. That's the other little bait and switch. Usually they don't offer you a discount on the plea deal unless you have some kind of connection to the system itself. Usually the plea deal number is the number they probably would have given you anyway, and the sans plea deal number they give you is inflated to make the sales pitch more convincing. Just a minor red pill for anyone who might find themselves in this situation out there. Call their bluff.
Yes,
They're probably gaslighting you.
and
It's a bait and
not only
switch.
that, a lot of these people they may only have a public defender, and public defenders they don't just take on one person's case. They have a whole slew of cases that they're all taking on at the same time. So they don't really have the time or the resources to pay as much attention to one person's case as they might require. And, this person, might have been able to fight against the state. And maybe they even had a chance to win. Maybe the state didn't have a strong case against them, but because they don't have a lawyer who's able to properly examine the situation, and they're probably terrified of going away to prison for a long time, they just take the deal.
And
And
another little piece of advice: if you find yourself in a prison situation, this is an excellent example of exactly why, if you do find yourself in a prison situation for the first time, spend however long you get studying law in the interim so that this shit never happens to you again. Because you would be amazed how many um, semi trailer sized loopholes there are in laws that if you don't bring up, they won't bring up. So be your own best defense, at least in the informal sense. By no means am I saying become your own lawyer or defend yourself, because as Benjamin Franklin said, he who represents himself has a fool for a client. But there's such a thing as being an informed client. And if your lawyer is shitty, he might require a little bit of backup storage, i.e., you. So it would help yourself and your lawyer immensely if you were at least mildly educated on legal proceedings.
that's one thing, in my opinion, they should include in high school, the basic understanding of the law.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of overly nationalistic or overly patriotic rhetoric in old civics books and stuff, so I understand why civics kind of went away for a bit, but I could really see a case for a reformed kind of civics class, because they don't teach They don't teach law, they don't teach basic psychology, they don't teach basic philosophy. There's a lot of the ethos of actually being able to think for yourself that is missing in the modern educational system. But that's a clusterfuck of a thing for another day.
One thing that I've also noticed is that POCs are also more likely to be held in prison before the trial. They'll most likely to be either set a bail amount that they're incapable of paying or just be denied bail. And that could have a very traumatizing effect on people. I mean, you're going through a very tumultuous time where you might be sentenced to prison for God knows how many years, and you have to deal with all this from the inside of a jail cell. I mean, that's definitely going to affect your ability to think properly and inform a proper defense rather
Yeah,
than if you were home and in a more calm, relaxed situation where you might be able
yeah.
to actually get your bearings.
And there are two meaningful asterisks we have to put beside all of this racial gobbledygook. One, the majority of so-called race issues in modern day America are not race issues, they are class issues, i.e., more pe- people of color go to prison because more people of color are poor, with the exception, of course, of Asians, if you include Asians as a part of people of color, in which case Asians get off better even than white people do. So it's very likely not a race issue usually. Usually it is a class issue, and class issues result in the kind of vulnerabilities which are exploited by drug dealers and gangs. And the second major asterisk is, of course, there is a especially if they're male component to this, because just like a white woman will get off in comparison to a white man, a black woman gets off in comparison to a black man. And honestly, if we're really being entirely honest with ourselves, if you compare the results of a black woman and a white man, the black woman is probably also going to usually get off easier, unless it is a very, very severe outlier. And that is usually the only time that female offendants get the book thrown at them anything like as hard as men in any other category.
You know, women
Hence
are
why we're covering it on this show, because it is at least tangentially a men's issue.
women were, I believe it was 58% less likely to be sentenced to prison. That is a big, huge disparity.
Yes, and even though I can hear somewhere in the ether them saying somebody saying, yeah, but that's because women have children they need to take care of, and the men won't do it because of the patriarchy. Well, isn't it convenient that all a woman therefore needs to do to get off of jail is get knocked up?
I
Meanwhile,
mean, men have children that they need to take care of too. I mean, many people in prisons are fathers, and that's actually created a big problem in the African American community
yeah,
where a lot of kids grow up without fathers because they're sentenced to prison for low level offenses and they're out of their lives at very critical
and
times.
and while we are here, just to give full context here, a woman who has a child is often spared prison, but a man who has a child can, in fact, have prison inflicted on him if he is unable to pay his child support payments. So just to clear crystallize that in people's minds once again, woman has child, she is now 58% or so less likely to go to prison. Men or man has child, is now actually, in some cases, more likely to go to prison because he has another factor that could land him there. Interesting how that worked, is it not?
One thing that I think we need to talk about is how prisons help criminals form connections. So you say you're good at picking locks in prison, and you meet other criminals who say have different skills, and then when you all get out, you meet up together, and you know what skills you all have, and then you go to commit a crime.
In other words, the prison system facilitates some Ocean's 11 shit.
It's like LinkedIn for criminals.
Like all I can think of right now is the Rick and Morty meme of their heist movie parody episode. So you son of a bitch, I'm in. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a good episode. But yeah, when they send criminals to prison, um, statistically, they are more likely to commit a crime when they get out. So
Yeah,
it actually just makes them better criminals.
yeah. There is a demonstrable pipeline from incidental uh or otherwise nonviolent crime goes to prison, leading to more violent crime. There is no such pipeline for someone who commits a severe crime being in any way reformed or having their criminal severity lessened by going to prison. In other words, if you're a stupid 19-year-old kid, get caught with, I don't know, some shrooms or whatnot, and you go to prison, you are more likely to become more like the hardened assaulters and burglars and so on. The burglars and the assaulters and so on are not in any degree, form, or fashion anywhere near as likely to become um, redeemed by the exposure to you as you are corrupted by the exposure to them.
Yeah.
So again, I must ask, are we absolutely sure this is the correct way of doing this? Because it seems like we're manufacturing severe criminals who, more importantly than that, aren't good at doing anything else unless they take a quite spectacular amount of initiative, an initiative that is quite frowned upon by many of their compatriots in the inside. So, yeah,
Not only that, but as a society, we are failing them when they get out. There's a lot of stigma against people who have been in jail.
yeah,
And
and
even if
this
somebody
is
comes out and they want to turn their life around, they don't want to go back to prison, it's going to be very difficult for them to find an apartment, find work, and people have to survive one way or another. And if they can't survive through legal avenues, then they'll try and survive through illegal avenues.
and once again, the only other alternative usually winds up in somewhere resembling the Brooks was here scene of Shawshank, which again I reference because it's a really good representation of this, and also it's one that most people, I dare say, at this point will have seen at least once. Because
I actually have not seen Shawshank. Unfortunately, I've always been meaning to, and just I've never had the chance.
get to the Ludovico technique chair from A Clockwork Orange. We need to fix this.
I've heard it's one of the best movies.
It it's one of those that I can watch over and over again because while it covers some truly dark subject matter, it's not a mean-spirited or a cynical movie, which is a very hard thing to do, and it manages it. I wish Hollywood would remember how it does that, but it's been a long time since 1994. As stupid and shallow as the 90s may have been, and they probably were, they look like the land of milk and honey in comparison to 2020.
Now, I think we should also talk about prison labor, about how some prisons will use convicts as basically free labor in order to do um,
Yeah,
various kinds of work. I don't know.
and it is worth noting that a large number of the um prisons that do use that system exist in southern and midwestern states, i.e., we say that we abolished slavery, but I think we might have just moved it.
Wasn't it a big thing that in California they were using convicts to fight wildfires?
I remember hearing something about that, but I'm not informed enough to say so.
I'm gonna look it up right now.
And to be fair, it is worth noting that using prisoners as a slave force is not a new phenomenon whatsoever. That there is documentation of Romans doing it, and I believe the Greeks also did it, although do not quote me on that. I don't know off the top of my head. It seems like one of the things they would have shared in common, because we know the Greeks had slaves and used them in a very similar manner, but I don't know of any particular examples of Greeks using their prisoners that way. However, I do know of several examples of the Romans doing it that way. So again, this is not a new phenomenon. Humans appear to be predisposed to humaning regardless of what era they find themselves in.
Yeah, apparently there's reports of California using female prisoners to fight wildfires, which in my opinion should be illegal.
Well, for any prisoner, certainly. I'm kind of
Yeah,
amazed
obviously.
that
That's
they used
the fact that
female
they're female is
prisoners.
not the point.
Right, but I'm kind of amazed they used female prisoners, because one would assume that they would try to protect women as a general rule, because again, human evolutionary psychology is a very, 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 very much solid thing. Um, so the immediate question that pops into my head at that point is, if they're using the women to fight fires, what the actual dystopian fuck do they have the men doing?
I have an article here from NPR. Prison labor has been a part of the U.S. economy since at least the late 19th century. Today, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
And that
Incarcerated people do everything from building office furniture and making military equipment to staffing call centers and doing 3D modeling.
okay, I'm less annoyed about the last two, because like, as annoying as telemarketing is, or 3D modeling is, there is at least a degree of humanity there. Um, but yeah, anything that resembles factory or plantation work is going to be a big no for me, dog. Again, it very much seems like instead of actually abolishing slavery, we just moved it. We allowed ourselves to believe in the notion that yes, it was wrong when we did it to every race, or when we did it to one particular race disproportionate to others, but it's right when we do it to people who have done fucked up because reasons. Never mind the principle of universal human dignity or anything.
I mean, why would they be? But would they be in call centers though? I mean, say you call a helpline and you get connected to Dwayne from Cell Block D.
I I I like I this amuses me very much, because all I can imagine is just like this big hulking guy with the tattoos with one of those like dainty headsets around his head saying sorry sir as he's being railed at by some entitled pissant wanting to get his phone fixed or something. Just telling himself to like just breathe. Remember what the doctor said. Remember what the warden said. Just breathing out. I'm sorry that was grossly insensitive, but it's a hilarious mental image. I, I'm I I'm kind of lenient on the 3D modeling thing as well because at least that's a usable skill that they might be able to make use of when they get out. And that's the thing. If more of this was developing skills that they can use once they get on the other side of the prison line, that would be one thing. But my one of the more one of the more insidious things about prison systems is that they tend to institutionalize, meaning they conform you to the culture of the inside and only the inside, to the point that when you do get out eventually, you're lost in a world that you don't understand and that refuses to understand you in any meaningful way, and so you work on getting sent back. And in fact, in one of the Hagbard Celine videos I mentioned earlier, and again, I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to understand the prison system better to watch Hagbard Celine's videos on the topic. Um, he told the story about how when he was on the bus heading there for the first time, he heard in the background people who had been repeat offenders um, making plans on how to get themselves sent back once they got out again, which is
Yeah,
just
because they can't,
is
they don't know how
yeah.
to survive in um, an outside world. Interestingly enough, that reminds me of it. Have you heard of the North Korea defector? I believe her name is Park. Um,
Um, Vaguely.
but anyway, after she escaped North Korea and escaped um, basically slavery in China, she made it to South Korea, and she was so surprised by how free it was. And sh- she's coming from a society where all her choices were made for her. I mean, she didn't even know how to decide what her favorite color was because the
The
government would
notion of
decide.
her opinion mattering on a topic like that didn't even occur to her, I would imagine.
Yes, the idea of making your own free choices was alien to her, so much so that she had actually considered going back to North Korea. She didn't, thank God, but that just goes to show that when you're used to a repressive system, freedom can seem more like a burden than an asset.
A similar thing happened in the 50s and 60s when the USSR was on its last legs and people started to find out what was going on in there, and people in there started figuring out what was going on here because the government of Russia, or I guess the USSR in this case, was making sure that they didn't get any American news or Western news because they wanted to tell their people that, yeah, it's bad here, but it's worse everywhere else. Let me tell you about all these awful things the Americans do. And as far as I'm aware, they still do that in North Korea. They still do the
Yeah,
um
she talked about that. They basically only refer to us as American bastards, and there's a bunch of other stuff that I don't quite remember, but it's all propaganda.
yeah,
Nothing they say goes.
they filter out any positive news to make it look bad, and they take any negative news and they overemphasize it or twist it to make it even more horrifying so as to demonstrate how backwards and barbaric American civilization is, which I can't imagine all the crazy opinion pieces in like the New York Times is really making that very difficult for them. Because if I were, one of the Kims, all I would do is send for some New York Times articles and whatnot, and then show them this is what American journalists think about and care about, or hell, tell your people, Mr. Kim, about the critical race theory and such. That will definitely make them more loyal to you, because in all honesty, a lot of Americans these days are thinking to themselves, maybe we should look into other cultures.
You know, I was looking at pay rates for prisoners, and while there are some programs that allow prisoners to earn real money and will teach them real skills. I read about a program in California that teaches prisoners to code, and after they got out, this one guy got a developer job at a startup. Maybe we should do that with journalists, but
I was literally just about to make the joke. The prison population is now more technically proficient than the journalist community.
but there are also prisoners who work inside the prison itself, people who work in like kitchen or laundry. They only make 12 to 40 cents an hour for like
Sense.
full days work. Yeah.
Did the no one's wage should be able to be measured in cents. No one. God damn it. I mean, maybe 100 years ago, when $1 could basically buy your groceries for the week, maybe, but certainly not in any post-gold standard civilization.
I mean, that is a crime.
Again, the more I look at this, the more it looks like we did not abolish the slave trade. All we did was move it and target it at the quote unquote deserving people.
Let me ask you, Dalton, if you had the power, political power, financial power, to reform the U.S. prison systems, what reforms would you implement?
That is tough. I think most of my reforms would be involved in not sending people there to begin with.
True, but there's always going to be some criminals that
Well,
you have
no,
to.
I'm not saying send nobody there, but I'm saying make it significantly easier to get off with other means of punishment, like community service or such, because prisons should exist. That I'm not saying abolish the prison. I'm saying we should reserve prisons for people that are otherwise unreformable. And also, I think it's worth noting that many countries focus more on rehabilitation than they do on punishment, and I think that is for the majority of prisoners the proper move. So in any event, I think I would probably create a 2-tier prison system, because I don't believe in the death penalty, but I have no qualms whatsoever with some of the worst examples of what it is to be a human being locked away for life in a fairly humane, and that is the phrase I would stress, prison system. However, most people who might not be light enough to justify community service, but are not heavy enough to justify the life in prison standard, probably should be put through some kind of reform process. So, one, reform the laws so as to make it more difficult to get people there in the first place. Two-tier prison system, heavily focused on reforming the vast majority of cases and only reserving hard prison for those that are the most inarguably deserving of being there, and not because we want to punish them, but because we just don't know what else to fucking do with them. and
Personally,
death
um,
penalty is inhumane. Yeah.
if I was going to reform the prison system, I'd basically use it as a filter. Um, you put them in basically general population, and you monitor the behavior. The people who you know are cooperating, who are basically trying to just get through their sentence and not get into any trouble. You then give them more privileges, more benefits, and the people who are causing problems, you basically separate them into another area of the prison.
Hmm.
So you so your behavior gets you rewards or punishments.
Yeah.
And one thing that I would make mandatory, it would be two things. One is job training or some kind of skill, maybe like um, a technical school or something like that, but also uh, psychiatric sessions, maybe group sessions or one-on-one sessions, but just
Yeah, I would add that I to some extent I agree with the idea of prisons being more like mental hospitals, but I think the difference between what I'm advocating for and what existed in the past is before they made mental hospitals too much like prisons. I'm advocating for making prisons more like mental hospitals because a staggering amount of criminal offenders are criminal offenders because they have some underlying or undiagnosed mental condition that kind of predisposes them to it. And in the process of reformation, there should be some kind of psychological evaluation component.
not just that, but also I think it would be good for you know just teaching them you know tools to deal with life
Yeah,
because a lot
and
of
or
people
stress.
they only turn to crime because they are struggling and they have no other options or they don't see the other options.
Yeah, or they've been horrifyingly abused by people in their life, which is the number one indicator for criminal behavior and psychopathy is trauma in childhood.
So our prison system, while it's not as barbaric as it used to be, there are still lots of problems with it. And
We're we're working on it.
all
Work
I
in
think
progress.
I think all our current prison system is really designed to do is give society a temporary reprieve from
Well,
people's criminal behavior.
it's like the homelessness issue. It's kind of an out of sight, out of mind. This is just normal fallacy. Um, you know, we all know there are people suffering in far off, distant history or distant geography, but as long as it's not in our face or on our doorstep, we don't generally care. Um, and because we don't generally care unless it's directly in our face, the problem continues to fester and continue to get worse and worse and worse, and that worsening is only made all the worse by taking all those problem cases and locking them in a giant stone box with metal bars in it. That that can only go on for so long before we wind up in a French Revolution situation.
Let me ask you something. Do you think people should have to disclose their conviction status if they get out of prison and are applying for work?
I'm of two minds on it because in most cases I would say no, especially if what they were in prison for is nonviolent and with a very minimal degree of likely repeatability. But in the case of the more severe cases, especially if there's a mental illness component, probably just for liability and also risk evaluation reasons. However, it'd be fabulous if I could say a blanket no, because it would be very nice indeed if the people who got out of prison were the people who deserved to get out of prison mostly. You didn't have to worry about some, multiple serial killer snapping one day and coming in with a gun and shooting everyone or something. But
Personally,
those severe cases do exist, and we have to account for them because life and/or reality be the way it be.
personally, the way I would do it is if the prison can vouch for his behavioral rehabilitation and a psychologist can account for his mental rehabilitation, then I wouldn't have a problem with that person's criminal record being sealed and them allowing to resume normal society when they get out. And that's, again, provided that they have both reformed both behaviorally and mentally.
Yeah, yeah, I broadly agree with that. My only problem is in such cases that behavior can be faked when the relevant people are watching, but
That's why I added
it's
the
yeah,
psychological component to it.
yeah, but it's a hell of a better system than the one we currently find ourselves in, and it would definitely cut down on the stigma of the um on the silent majority, because again, much in the same way as when we covered homelessness, my my advice to people who, the normies, for lack of a better word, who question going, what do we do about this problem, is first look in a mirror, because systems like this can't go unchecked for this long without somebody somewhere saying, well, it's just a fact of life, it's just normal, it's just something we have to deal with. Well, if you take that attitude, then you take, unfortunately, the consequences of that attitude. If if you
One
assume,
thing that
go
one
ahead.
thing that I think would help is just treating prisoners with a bit more dignity. I mean, you're there to punish them, surely, but obviously that punishment shouldn't involve them degrading even further into criminality. And I think part of that reason is because they are stripped of their dignity while they're inside.
Yeah, and again, the number one indicator for violent sociopathy of any meaningful description is trauma, and the place and time when people are the most susceptible to extremist views or extreme behavioral fluctuations is when they are vulnerable and traumatized. So if you don't want more violent criminals, then stop motherfucking traumatizing them when they're in there, you dumbasses. Because you're putting all the worst cases in a box together and putting fresh meat in with them, and then wondering why you put in, 1,000 drug offenders and you take out 500 hardened criminals at the end of the day.
Yeah, I also think the drug crime thing needs to be undone. It should never been put in place in the first place.
Yeah, the
And
war on drugs was as stupid or more so than the war on terror, to be honest.
and I think private prisons should also be abolished. You shouldn't be able to make a business out of the
Yeah,
incarceration of your fellow human beings.
yeah, and just before we get into this, by no means are we saying that the profit motive is bad. The profit motive is a good thing in most cases. However, when human lives are the currency and the ruination of them is likely going to be the result, at that point the profit motive needs to be compartmentalized off into its own corner.
Do you have any other thoughts on our prison system?
Well, we never really got into the gender sentencing gap. I mean, we spent quite an awful
We
long
did
time talking
cover
about.
that a bit in a previous episode.
We did, but for completeness' sake, we can do a quick rundown of it again, I think.
All right, I think I have the stats up here.
Yeah.
See, women are less likely to be detained before trial. They were 46% less likely than men to be held in jail prior to their trial. So, like we mentioned before, where you're held before trial can have a big impact on your mentality going into it, which could determine whether or not you're able to mount a proper defense. And women are less likely to be held in jail, which means that they're less likely to be um, mentally burdened with jail going into their trials, which is a huge advantage.
Mm-hmm. Because as we all know, especially for first-time offenders, a lot of prison systems and or officers go with the scared straight model of justice, i.e., let's spook them as much as possible while they're in the lockup, and then that will hopefully reform them for later. Well, that also has the unfortunate side effect of scaring them shitless before they need to go to trial, and that makes it very hard to defend yourself.
They also have less bond amounts, so you know you have to pay your bail in order to get out of prison if they even allow you out. And women tend to have less bail amounts than men do, which, in my opinion, is not really fair. I mean, you know, if say you are committing the same crime, like why would the men have to pay more as if they would have access to necessarily more money than the women would?
And or if it's not that, if the reason is because she's a woman and therefore she deserves more mercy, then I must proffer the question of, if we are all to be subservient to the concept of equality, then why don't we just lower the bail threshold for men as well? Because we could go either way with this. We could make women have to pay more, or we could just have everyone pay less. And I think the second is both more plausible and more lenient.
I think though that there are some situations where bail should be withheld.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure you're familiar with the Waukesha terrorist attack, where a man drove a van into a parade, killing, I
Yes.
believe it
While
was,
we were away, a lot of shit happened.
yeah. Anyway, he was a
The month
career
before.
criminal, and he was out on bail then, and he had previously skipped bail a number of times, and even then they only on this occasion before he committed the attack, I believe his bail was only $1,000. I mean, if he's been a repeat offender and known to skip bail, they should have just held him without bail at that point.
Yeah, like the old adage of "fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me"
In
thing
this situation
comes
it's
up.
more like fool me 7 times, and he
Yeah,
has a rap sheet going back, I believe, to the early 2000s.
yeah. If he's a runner and can be demonstrably shown to be a runner, then why the fuck was any bail amount posted for him? Also, one wonders from what orifice he's pulling all this money out of. I wish I had that ability, but that's neither here nor there.
um he's he was a pimp, I believe. That might be where he's getting that money from.
Aha.
Although I don't think he
Well,
has to get out of bail now, because obviously what he did was monstrous.
egregious to a ludicrously stupid degree if we weren't going like the book exists to be thrown in these kind of situations. Like I'm against generally throwing the book at someone, but when you are this far through the looking glass then you are subject to the Red Queen's justice at that point, to complete the metaphor.
Yeah.
I.e.,
So
off with your head.
I don't believe that first-time offenders should be given uh, high bail, but when it's a repeat offender with a propensity for skipping bail, then just withhold bail.
Yeah. If you know full well the bail is only going to exacerbate the problem, then stop fucking exasperating the problem
And
that is within your power to solve.
on the opposite end of the spectrum, uh, Kyle Rittenhouse, when he was arrested, I believe his bail was like what, $2 million.
Uh-huh.
But he comes from a divorced, I believe, lower middle class family. He,
Yes, sir.
they're not gonna have $2 million.
Although I hazard a guess that this was more for philosophical, ideological, and moral quote unquote reasons than being proportional to the crime. Because there are mass murderers whose bail was not that high.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I am I'm really glad that he was found not guilty because it was
On
so
International
obvious to
Men's Day of
everyone
all
who looked at
days,
the
which was nice.
evidence. What did you say?
I said, and he was found innocent on, or not guilty on International Men's Day, which was nice and symbolic.
Yeah, and I'm also glad that Jesse Smollett was found guilty.
Yeah, if there is a more beautiful microcosm of the world today than those three cases, the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, the case of the Waukesha or Waukesha incident, and the case of Jesse Smollett, I can't think of it. That it was a perfect chef's kiss trifecta of, you know, the current state of affairs capsulated in three perfect, like a perfect triangle of legal cases.
All
It's almost just it almost makes me want to check my room for Truman Show style cameras, because it's almost like something a writer would come up with.
well, they say that reality is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, and our reality appears to be written by either George Orwell or Aldous Huxley at the moment.
That reminds me of something that I wanted to ask you. Say that somebody uh, tries to use basically the justice system as a weapon against somebody else. Say like they accuse somebody else of a crime that they did not commit. What do you think the punishment should be for that? Because I've heard some people say that it should be the same amount of time that the person that they were
Yeah,
trying to
I'd say directly in proportion to whatever the accusation was. It, if you can be demonstrated to have knowingly and willfully inflicted or tried to inflict, you know, a life sentence on someone, then guess what? You you were willing and pursuing the course of action to inflict a life sentence on somebody, so now get to experience that. It's the old adage of play stupid games, win stupid prizes. If you don't want to be disemboweled by an angry genie, don't rub the fucking bottle, you moron.
All right, we've been going for a little over an hour. I think now is a good place to end it.
Yeah.
All right. Like we mentioned throughout this video, we seriously need to have a movement to reform the prison system in the United States of America because it's not really helping at all. All it is really just putting people on the sideline for a little while, and then they
It's
come
the
back
it,
worse.
it's the societal equivalent of trying to sweep your dusty room by lifting up the rug and putting it all underneath there. You can't just say out of sight, out of mind, not my problem, because problems fester, especially when you stick them all in a box. If the myth of Pandora teaches us anything, it's when you put all the evils of the world in a box, all you're doing is creating a time bomb for some motherfucker to come along, open said box, and then 1,000 years of darkness.
All right, everybody, I've been Mr. E.
And I have been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator. We have been the Duality of Man.
See you guys
Cheers,
later.
guys.